This song is dedicated to our ancestors.
In so many traditions, whether it is within Islam or within Christianity or within Hindu traditions, the temple has a threshold one has to cross before one enters it. And when one crosses that threshold, one is asked to leave one space behind and enter into a new space. And that is both a spiritual threshold, and is also a physical threshold. It may be leaving one's shoes at the door, washing oneself ritualistically with intention and attention to what that can offer you, to leave the world of the physical and the toxicity of the human experience perhaps behind as we enter a space where we are attuned to the divine. And that is something we can comprehend and we can understand in Western cultures, especially. There is a church. You go to a church and you bow your head. You come respectfully. You wear respectful clothes. You don't raise your voice. You abide by the rules of the temple. But the mystic knows that although a house of worship is a sacred space, it is also a form. And God is formless. How are we to know how we can confine the divine? We know nothing. It exceeds any form. And that if we behave in one way inside a temple and another outside, then we have misunderstood the very nature of what it is to be a spiritual human being. And I think you spoke of tasks, and I think the task before us is to relearn what it means to walk as if everywhere is a temple, and not to hold it as some adage or aspiring bumper sticker that we put on the back of our car, but becomes a mantra which is as important as the repetition of the name of God with each breath. To approach how we are in relationship to the living earth as if it were a temple. Because how one prepares oneself or how one interacts with anything shifts how one interacts with anything. That is just common sense. We know this. As we do wudu, we prepare to go into the mosque. We have transformed and left one reality behind and entered another. But can we do this when we step out our doors and into a world where the non-human is existing all around us, whether that is in a wild landscape or an urban landscape, because the non-human is there everywhere. Even if we have concretized it and banished it and destroyed it, it's still there. But how do we prepare ourselves for this interaction and relationship so that we do not continue to just project ourselves into landscapes and walk through them in our own corridors of self-created fantasy, blocking us from the possibility of communion and kinship and relationship that is coming at us all around us all the time if we can be attentive to it. Because we do that so often. And we can even feel the great benefits of walking into a forest, even if we are completely consumed by our own thoughts and our own minds and our own emotions and our own stories, because the enormity of what surrounds us is so great that it can offer regardless. But if we take time and attention to transform ourselves just a little bit when we move from one threshold to another, it can transform far more than we realize. If we take the time to remove our thoughts, to step back from our own self-centeredness, to align ourselves with our breath and our step and the inner attunement of divine presence that exists at the essence of our being and our hearts. And we continue to be attentive to that as we walk across the threshold. Then we are one step further to being able to be in a relationship with the earth as if it is a temple. And then our experience of what that landscape can teach us, can invite us into, can shift within us, is remarkably powerful. If we take away the veneer of our own egoic nature as we step into that space, we become porous. We are able to listen in a way we could not listen to before, because before we were just speaking and pretending we were listening, even if no words were coming from our lips. But to be porous and to listen. And at first we hear a bird and we recognize that bird. We may even know what that bird is. We see a tree, we see a species, we maybe even know what that species is. We can identify it. But that is just the first layer, because names are things that we have granted. And yes, there is tremendous power and responsibility in naming, but there is something that exists behind the names, which is where the names came from. And if we begin to be in relationship with the essence of each being that we encounter, then that thread that I spoke of, that exists between our hearts, the source of who we are as mystics, and every creature can be threaded again and again and again, because that thread, it forms something. It weaves something. And Sufis, we like to use weaving as a metaphor, because we know what it means to weave. The power in weaving, the attention it requires to really weave something, to bridge spirit and matter together. And that is what can happen when we cross that threshold, when we remove ourselves as we walk through the door from the human to the non-human and expand our presence and awareness and remind ourselves again and again of the vast experiences which are there for us to participate in, not for our own benefit, to calm us and to make us feel joyful. Yes, those are lovely benefits, but again, because it is a responsibility that the mystic has. Because if the mystic does not utilize what it has at its disposal, which is the ability to recognize source in other beings, then it again is doing a disservice to its essential nature. So perhaps there are two sins: to forget one's breath and to not honor the ability we have in our very being to recognize the source of creation in other beings. Not just with our eyes and our ears and our senses, but with our hearts, the heart of hearts, and the energy that exists there that can be woven in a web of relationship which creates a container that can hold landscapes, so that we do not end up repeating again and again this violence and subjugation and destruction of the living world and all that is within it and the peoples that are within it. Because we have to find a way to create a foundation again, to sing back into the landscape through our hearts, in the way that the ancient peoples of this earth had done for millennia and millennia and millennia, singing in relationship with the land. Through their stories, through their prayers, through their footsteps, through their every action, it was a temple. And mystics know this too. And I think we have to acknowledge the responsibility that that awareness asks of us, and where that can take us to shift our day-to-day interactions with everything by expanding the notion of a temple, configuring ourselves into landscapes, not bound by the limitations of our egoic nature, but by the boundless potential of our soul's nature. And the love that exists at the core of our being, that also exists in the core of every other being. Because that is at the base of kinship. Love is at the base of our kinship. Love can be at the base of how we again remember what it means to be a human in this landscape. And to hold the enormity of what has shifted in a landscape. Because a landscape holds so much. It is the container for everything that lies within it. For the trees, for the rivers, for the mountains, for the four-legged creatures, for the winged creatures, and of course for our own selves, for the elements. It holds so much, is contained within that landscape. And landscapes flow from one to another. They are not delineated by boundaries. Even if we think they come to an end, they really do not, they flow. It has been one of the profound revelations that we have come to terms with in the midst of this ecological crisis is there are no boundaries. The human landscapes that we think we control flow into the wild landscapes and have profound effects. There is no delineation, and they hold so much, and they have changed so much in our lifetimes. And what does that mean? What does that ask of us? How does it shift our perception of these landscapes and our ability to relate to these landscapes as mystics, as lovers of God, of those who seek the root of the root of the root, the essence behind creation that exists in landscapes and is yet not bound by landscapes? Where does this take us? And what is our responsibility as we walk through these landscapes? As you so beautifully put, Sia, watching our step, being aware of our breath, and journeying towards home, towards our goal, which of course is the ground beneath our feet as much as it is the heavens above and the inner landscapes of our soul. What is our responsibility as mystics at this time to walk with another one of the principles of our shared lineages of remembrance of God, remembrance of our beloved, remembrance of the divine nature of creation that exists in every substance, known and unknown, here and unseen. How can we be present in this changing landscape, holding what we know to be true in our hearts, that there is everywhere the essence of the divine, and yet at the same time hold how much has been forgotten that requires us to be in remembrance, how much has shifted, how much has been disfigured, how much has been altered in just 2 generations, and not just polluted outwardly in our rivers and in our air, in our forests, but also what has been polluted inwardly, and the inner landscapes of the soul, which are deluged by distractions and untruths and so many things that I think neither of us could have imagined 30 years ago, and I'm sure your grandfather could never have imagined 100 years ago that we would be in this place now. And so what does it ask of us? What is our responsibility? How should we walk? How should we be present? How should we be aware of what is unfolding, bearing witness to the destruction, bearing witness to this change, bearing witness to this desacralization of forgetfulness that lies at the heart of the crisis we are experiencing? And yet not be so overwhelmed by this disheartening nature of reality that we do not forget what it means to be a mystic, which is to be in remembrance, no matter how hard it is to place one step in front of the other as we walk through a barren landscape. But it is our duty, it is what defines us, to always be in remembrance. Because the greatest sin that a mystic can ever do is to not be in that state of remembrance, to utter a breath that does not praise the divine with the most essential nature of what it is to be a human, which is to breathe, to breathe. The science of the breath. I was reading about your grandfather's reflections on the science of the breath, this profound evolution that has existed in all lineages and all mystical traditions for millennia, and how this connects us on levels we do not truly understand with so many natures of reality. How it invites us to be present on multiple levels at the same time, to magnetize the most essential ingredient of what it means to be human, to breathe with remembrance, prayer of the divine, that then transforms that prana into an energy which can bring the soul into communion and connection with the divine, and bring us closer to the manifestations that are around us at all times, that take that fundamental truth of source that exists at the heart of the mystic and allows that thread to be woven from our heart into the hearts of every other being, every other presence, and thus reflect that light of creation back into existence. That is the mystic's responsibility. And to do that while holding and bearing witness to what is unfolding around us, acknowledging it from the depths of our being. And you spoke so beautifully about these ways of walking in a landscape. And something that I find myself drawn to so often, again and again, is how to walk more deeply, bringing my physical presence, my human presence, through the simple action of my step, aligned with my breath, with the earth that lies beneath my feet. And how I really have no idea yet how to do that, because the depth of what is possible in that relationship is far exceeds anything that I could ever assume to understand. And how we can use our breath as a conduit of connection, leaving our mouth and flowing to the earth beneath our feet, creating a bridge of kinship, of respect, of connection, and of acknowledgement. And then inviting through our breath that relationship up through our body and into our hearts, into the heart of our hearts, and then offer it back to God. And to try to do that as much as I can, daily, simply remembering what it means to walk and to breathe and to be present in a landscape that is unfolding around me. Thank you for bringing in those beautiful principles that our lineages share. To walk with remembrance, watching one's step, always attuned to the journey home.